Hello there, this is Nerd World Empire, and returning to the Delphic Expanse, we're going to discuss what we know about the 6 Xindi races. And yes, there were 6 if you had forgotten that. This report will break down the characteristics of each species. Before we get started, like, share, subscribe. Comment down below which one was your favourite. Do you hate them all? Did you really love or hate the Xindi arc overall? And of course there is a playlist probably linked up here, whichever way that one does, I can never remember, to the rest of the playlist of this series. Let's begin with the aquatics. The aquatics by nature. Now I should disclaimer note, there are apocryphal names for these races, but there are no official names, so we're going to assume that Universal Translator translates whatever their local species name for each other is into reptilian, primate, arboreal, whatever, and whatever their local dialect word for that species, say aquatic, is, it translates into English just as aquatic. Let's say that, because maybe that was true, probably not, but let's say it was. So let's start with the aquatic. The aquatics, as their name would imply, were a marine sentient species. In appearance they were somewhere like between a whale and a seal, maybe, but they breathed underwater through gills. They communicated through high-pitched whale song, basically through squeals, and they were known as an incredibly deliberate species, and also famed for their patience and taking a very long time to make a decision. They of course swam through the water and couldn't, as far as we know, breathe out of the water, and required environmental suits to move around in environments that they were not native to, which basically meant anything other than water. The species' environmental requirements were different to those of other species. So although an M-class environment would probably be what they would want, you've got to start factoring in things like salinity, water pressure and density and other such things, as well as general contaminants in the water that their species would have to contend with that an air-breathing race might not have to. In terms of their technology, of course, it was similar to that of all the other Xindi, except it was designed to operate underwater. You'd have to imagine that there are certain elements of it that they would never have used. For example, this race would probably have never invented fire. So they would have had to have used chemical reactions to generate heat and create welding. It's possible that their race utilized vacuum environments in the deep ocean, now they're more advanced, and probably traded much of their earlier technology off the other species. As I said, they were known for their patience and being very deliberate in their actions, and not known for making snap or rash decisions, and were considered, although probably the individually more advanced of the races, were culturally more secretive and generally made you deal with them on their terms. Next, let's go with the primates. The primates, as stated, were the closest to the humans. They were the near-human race, basically humanoid with some cranial ridges, and although there were similarities in some of their facial ridgings with the other species, which all the Xindi seem to have certain commonalities in that area, the primates were known to be quite level-headed. They were also known to be honourable, and generally, again, somewhere like humans, they were a race known more for looking for a diplomatic or rational solution to a problem, and in their dealings with other races. But they themselves could be rather belligerent. Physically, it's not believed they were any stronger than a normal human. So they weren't anywhere like the physicality of the insectoids, reptilians, and certainly not like the aquatics. The next race we're going to look at were the arboreals. There's not really much to say on them, but this isn't to cover their technology, I should point out. I've done that in the previous videos. The culture of each of these races is similar, and therefore we just sort of going to focus on their distinctions. The arboreals were probably closely related to the primates, but they did have physical features that were, from a human point of view, rather sloth-like, which could imply they had a different genial ancestry, but most likely they were a close biological relative of the so-called primate species, meaning they were probably a primate themselves, descended also from some kind of arboreal primate, something, say, like an orangutan on Earth. Now, they were also known to be level-headed. They seemed to be more a commercially orientated people, a little bit perhaps not like the Ferengi where they're greedy, but certainly they were a people who devoted much of their time to science, engineering and problem solving. whereas the primates were the sort of level-headed diplomats. These were the engineers and scientists working behind the scenes to structure their society. They were known for manufacturing and industrial capabilities, and their ships and their technology tended to reflect that aspect of their culture, at least from what we saw of it. Next, the reptilians. The reptilians, as the name would imply, were a repto-humanoid species, physically much more stronger and more durable than a baseline human. They had a greenish-brown skin, excellent eyesight, good sense of smell. They liked warm environments, whereas, say, the arboreals, one notable feature of the people is they didn't like being underwater, so their interactions with the aquatics were probably uncomfortable for them, whereas the reptilians, it didn't bother them, but they did like to be warm, and they didn't have much of a tolerance for the cold. They were known to be very belligerent and could be very aggressive. They operated strong, powerful warships and were generally a race who, though were not quick to action, were not afraid of it and were much more violent by nature, were more likely to resort to an aggressive solution to a problem rather than a diplomatic one. This is why it was surprising when Dolan was willing to listen to the reasonings and machinations of the humans about the sphere builders. Everyone was rather shocked that the reptilians did have do a 180 on what would be their usual methodology. That's not to say that none of the reptilians were capable of being level-headed and rational, it's just it wasn't in their cultural norm zeitgeist. Next would be the insectoids. Last but not forgotten, insectoids were weird, to put it bluntly. They only lived about 12 years, similar to a race like the Okampa. Their names got longer as they got older, and they seem to reproduce asexually, although it is plausible that they did actually have multiple genders as well. Whether or not they were a hive-like culture was never explained, but I don't believe they were, so I don't think they were ant-like despite their ant-ish appearance. I think they were more like beetles or some other creature that simply was born pregnant and reproduced its whole life, but probably still did have male or female attributes either for all of them or for individuals. It was never fully explained. They were extremely aggressive and very belligerent, and unlike the reptilians, were much more prone to being rash in their actions. They were short-tempered and known for quick judgments. However, it was actually the insectoids, of them and the reptilians, that first began to question whether or not the sphere builders were really on their side, and they had the best interests of the Xindi at heart, because they clearly fucking didn't. The last race, the sixth race, the forgotten species of Xindi, had been extinct by the time of first contact with humanity for about 100 years, and they were the avians. They were capable of flight, and we know that they had off-world colonies. One of their outposts was actually where the Xindi council would meet. Now, there are some anecdotal evidence that perhaps, hypothetically, the avians did not all die out. Now, they did have off-world colonies, which implies they had space-faring technology of some kind, whether they used the vortexes like the other Xindi, or they had some kind of older technology, whether it was even just sublight, they had it. They were able to get off-world. The idea that all of them were wiped out in the war is a little hard to believe, but perhaps it is true. They may just not have had survivability in them. However, other avian species have been encountered unnamed by Starfleet, so it is plausible that perhaps the avians survived, if not a tad unlikely, but it is hypothetically plausible that their race are still out there somewhere, hiding. Perhaps so few of them survived, and the fact that the reptilians and the insectoids had tried so hard to exterminate them from their point of view, they didn't want anything to do with the rest of the Xindi, and they just went into hiding. It is a plausible theory. However, we don't know much about them in terms of their structured anatomy. We believe they were bird-like, but we don't know. They may have been more bat-like. All we ever saw of them was a skull, which did seem to have an extended snout-like structure, but that didn't necessarily mean beak. So what they were, don't know. To be honest, the skull looked more pterosaur than bird to my eye, but whatever. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Didn't they survive, and exactly what do you think they looked like? How do you think they flew? Do you think their wings were attached to their arms, or do you think they had separate arms with a separate pair of wings? Which would make more sense, but doesn't necessarily have to be the case. I just want to take this moment to thank you for watching that video. If you liked what you saw, please check out my social links in the description box below to Instagram and Twitter and others, and there also is down there a link to my Patreon page where you can support this channel and the others as I try to grow this franchise and do this more regularly.
If you made it all the way to the end of this video, thank you for watching, and bye bye.